Hello, everybody, and welcome to the This.Labs podcast, episode 3. Today, we're going to be talking about migrations, software migrations, and all things related to that. But before we get into that, I'll introduce all of my co-hosts. So, as usual, I'm joined by Tracy Lee, founder at This. Hey, Tracy, how are you doing?
Hello.
We're also joined by Jarrod Overson, a director at Shape Security, and a brand new Google developer expert. Hey, Jarrod, how's it going?
Going well. Thank you very much.
And we're also joined by James Spivey, a director of engineering at Shutterstock, which is also new. So, James, thanks for joining us.
How's it going?
And I am Rob Ocel. I'm a senior developer at This. So, one more thing before we get into talking about migrations. We'd be foolish to miss this opportunity to mention what happened yesterday, because we're recording this on April 2nd. So this is just on the far side of April Fools, right? And so April Fools is a great day for people to learn what an appropriate prank is and what an inappropriate prank is. And it's a time for companies to get out there and kind of show their silly side. And I think it's also a time for companies to show the products that they want to sell, but they don't want you to think that they were being serious. So they just want to try it out. And if it hits, right? So for that, I'm thinking of Lego announced an augmented reality app for your phone that essentially would scan a pile of Legos and highlight the Legos that you were looking for. You could tell it which type of Lego block you were looking for. And everybody on the internet was like, yes, that's a terrible joke. Yes, give it to us. And I think Lego's now like, okay, good idea, intern. You get a promotion, do that. But so my question to everybody is going to be, what was the best April Fool's joke, prank, announcement, fake thing that you saw? And the Lego one was not necessarily mine. So mine is going to be the dev.to, the blogging site, switch their default font to Comic Sans. Now, that by itself is not necessarily funny, but the thing of it is I saw a blog post posted by John Papa. And when I opened up his blog post and I saw it was in Comic Sans, I'm like, very funny, John. This is going to be a really funny joke article because you put it in Comic Sans for April Fools. And I read through it and I'm like, oh, that was actually a really serious blog post about how to be a public speaker. I'm like, why was it in Comic Sans? And then I realized, I was like, so it was a great prank because it pranked authors as well.
I literally did the exact same thing and read the exact same blog post and thought the same exact feeling.
There you go. So James, how about you? What did you see? Anything funny?
I think every year that ThinkGeek has the best one. So this year they did a onesie with a beanbag built into it, and that was my favorite because it just looked so ridiculous.
Oh, that's great. How about you, Jarrod? What did you see?
So what I came across was, so remember Final Fantasy VII from like 13,000 years ago?
Yeah.
It's a very old Final Fantasy game. Spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't played it. Aerith dies, but there was always this rumor that she was able to be resurrected with some sort of obscure Easter eggy type sequence. And there was a video that purported to have solved that sequence yesterday, and I remember watching it. It was like, this is amazing. And then like about halfway through, you realize that it's a ridiculously complex thing that isn't actually a real sequence. I got fooled, and it was awesome because it reminded me of a game I played 20 years ago.
There you go. It sounds a lot like the rat race to find Mew the urban legend of how to find Mew in the original Pokemon. Yeah.
Yeah.
How about you, Tracy? I'm sure you had your finger on the pulse of a lot of funny April Fool's jokes.
I wish it was that amusing for me, but actually it wasn't that amusing. So basically, it was, let's see, Jay created this thing called NoFux, N-O-F-U-X, the unpredictable state container for JavaScript apps. You can find it at github.com/jfelp/nofux, which I found amusing. And then I saw something about branded fruit, and I was thinking, what is this branded fruit thing that they're talking about? And it was just, I I mean, it's actually a thing. Did you guys know that? Somebody was asking for branded avocados. And
I thought it was real. Was that was there a joke that went with it, or was that the joke?
no, it was real, but I thought it was a joke.
Stranger than fiction. Yeah.
Yeah, but no, there's a company called Branded Fruit, and they do like fruit with your logo on it for, you know, for I guess conferences. So they responded back and said, you know, yes, we're serious. And it was Sirius XM logo on an orange. I was like, yes, I love you. But yeah. So,
hashtag not a sponsor, but if you want to, we already have shown that we love your product. So
exactly.
Well, great. Yeah, April Fool's, you know, always a good time. I've got a small child now, so I'm sure these April Fool's jokes are only going to get more interesting as the years go on. But yeah, we'll dive right in now. So today's topic is migration. So we're not slowing down with the broad topics, right? We did performance, then we did architecture. We've covered everything there was to cover about architecture. And now we're going to talk about migrations. And why is migrations interesting? Well, migration is interesting because it just seems to be whenever, as a consulting company, we talk to companies, they always have a product or a system that was built however it needed to be built. And they come to us and they ask, you know, we want it to be something else, right? So some of the different types of migrations we've obviously heard of, and probably you guys have heard of too. Changing front-end frameworks, so people that are wanting to move from things like AngularJS or, you know, any other backbone or whatever they're using to use something like Angular or React or Vue or Polymer or whatever, or you know, Preact or whatever it is that they want to use. I've talked to people that wanted to change cloud providers, which is actually, you know, I don't know if it's surprisingly complicated, but it is. There's a lot to think about if you're moving from Azure to AWS or backwards or to, you know, Google Cloud Platform or any of that. Also talk to people that have wanted to change like third-party integrations. So like data repositories, like somebody hosted their data and gave them an API to access it, and they switched to a different data provider. And that was, you know, surprising a lot of work. Are there any other types of migrations that you guys have experienced or dealt with or talked to people that have gone through or gone through yourself?
Yeah, certainly. For us at Shape, we migrated actually our entire defense platform from one stack to another after we were scaling and realized that we needed to handle network traffic in a much more robust manner. And that was a monstrously complex and risky endeavor. It ended up working out, but it took us several months of figuring out how to do that. And basically what it amounts to is we got a reverse proxy that's supposed to proxy HTTP traffic, and then anyone who works on the web knows that that's probably a nightmarish proposition, because you just have to deal with whatever comes your way and make sure you don't explode in horrible ways. So we took the network stack, Java network stack that we had, and then translated to some sort of like Nginx Java hybrid, and it was a monstrously complex problem, and we did it in a way that allowed us to take one out and put one in front of major companies' sites, and it worked, but it was terrifying.
I've done, one of the things I see a lot in the Angular community is moving from a sort of a basic state management system, you know, just using services and doing subjects, whatever, you know, sort of the simple entry approach, and then migrating into something like NGRX and doing more functional, you know, sort of one-way type migrations. I've seen that a fair number of times and have helped with a bunch of those. And that's always a really interesting experience, because a lot of times it's teaching an entire team how to change their thinking about where things are referenced from and what that, you know, Redux flow looks like. And that whole process of implementing that can be touchy at times, but often has a lot of value add in terms of taking the time to do.
Cool. Yeah, and so when we're talking about migrations, and maybe throughout this conversation we'll be kind of weighing the pros and cons, things that people need to worry about, stuff like that. Is there any value in differentiating for people, like what makes a migration? Like, is it important to say what that is? Because I'm sure some people might wonder, like, what's the difference between a migration, like we're trying to talk about, and a refactoring, right? Like, what's the difference? Like, isn't that just refactoring, or, you know, just, you know, adding a new feature? Like, what makes these things different?
I think a lot of that comes down to, a refactor, generally speaking, most people on the team sort of already understand the content and it's just trying to optimize how things work. I tend to think of a migration more of, we not only have to migrate some code to something else, but the team has to be sort of migrated in knowledge as well. So there is a spin up process where the rest of the team has to be taught or otherwise brought up to speed on the new concepts that are going to be moved to, so that they're all familiar with what that looks like before you actually start the process of migrating a bunch of code into that new system, whatever it might be, whether it go from framework or backend or state management. It's a lot more about helping the team move forward into this next thing that we're going to be doing. And then the code sort of comes along, as opposed to just, we want to optimize the path of the code or, be more dry or whatever that might be, which is where you typically get more of a refactor.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about it a little bit, and like this was kind of how it made sense in my head. I mean, I don't know if this is actually a valid distinction, but when you're talking about a new feature, right? So in all cases, we're applying effort, right? We're applying developers, we're applying time, we're applying money. When you're doing a new feature, you're adding new behaviors to professional podcasting here. So when you're making a new feature, you're talking about applying effort, applying time, applying developers to create a new feature, a new functionality, new behavior for your system, right? When I'm thinking about a refactoring, you're talking about applying that time, that effort, and those developers to have the same system. It's the same behavior, right? It's not changed behavior, but it's somehow cleaner in some way that's meaningful. It's more efficient, it's more buildable, it's more maintainable, right? So then when you're thinking about refactoring, or excuse me, migrations, you're talking about applying all that time, all that effort, and really kind of having the same behavior and more or less having the same cleanliness, right? Because you're actually just swapping out components or you're swapping out the framework. It's not that you're necessarily making it inherently any more efficient. It's not like a refactoring, right? Because you're changing fundamental building blocks, but you're also not adding new behaviors. You might be laying the groundwork for you to add those new behaviors, but you're not necessarily doing it in that vein. And I think that's part of why sometimes these migrations are scary. It's because when you're talking to a business and you're saying, we're going to take all this time and this money, and you're going to get the exact same system in the end. Hopefully the same system.
Hopefully. I was going to say there's a real big caveat asterisk to that one. And how many times have we all done a migration that also suddenly evolved into a scope creep where we were adding a whole bunch of new features because we had all these new toys and new things to play with? So I think that tends to happen a fair amount.
Yeah, so that brings up a good question. Why would you migrate to anything? Like if you have to justify that to product-minded people or executives, how do you justify that? What are the reasons to migrate from one thing to another ever?
One of the things I hear a lot is the what is it? Hiring, right? We can't stay on this tech stack because otherwise we're not going to be able to recruit people. So I feel like I see it. I mean, right now we have a lot of clients who are migrating from, let's say Flash to Angular. We have clients migrating from Ember to React. And with Ember, actually, it's because of the talent. So they can't find the talent to hire. So it seems to be, and I don't know what your guys' experience is, but it seems to be a lot of times, how do you actually even find the developers that are actually going to work on this technology? And then as technologies become out of date, it becomes, number one, harder, but also number two, more expensive.
Yeah, I was just going to say LTS support's a big one. Stuff, when Apple killed Flash, that really, Flex was a really big market. I did it for a long time. There was a lot of us doing it and it was great. But then, Flash Player dies off and they open source it. And pretty much everyone said, well, if we stay on this, then it's going to become harder and we might not be able to run it, and et cetera, et cetera. We can't deal with new features, all that sort of stuff. And so then there's a conscious business decision to go, okay, well, we need to start moving away from this. I've seen that a lot in government industries where it's like, okay, well, we need to start moving away from this. what are the larger frameworks that we can move to, and that's when you start that process. And then, yeah, you see a lot around the hiring too of, you know, what's available. You know, you tend to see more React developers than you see Angular developers. So there's a certain cost to that versus what it supplies, that sort of stuff.
Or how many times have we seen, you know, new architects come in and just all of a sudden, hey, we, you know, I believe in React. Okay, go to React. You know, we've had this one client where, you know, first off, it was migrating from, you know, nothing to Ember. So an entire year doing that. And then the next year was moving from Ember to React, an entire year doing that, not finished. Every stage was actually not finished. And then next year was, okay, let's move from React to Angular. And we were like, okay, we'll do it for you. But why? And it was only because a new architect came in and decided that was the thing.
Wanted to do what they wanted to play with. I think that's a really interesting point too, is that you do tend to see a lot of sort of high-level architects that come in and just based off personal opinions, they believe it's more optimal to move to something else completely rather than saying, we've invested all this time and space, let's stay the course and not migrate. Because you know, it's easier for them to kind of stay in the wheelhouse. And I think there's ebbs and flows, like ups and downs to that attitude. You know, obviously pushing technology forward is great, but at the same time that can cost a business. And I think that's not necessarily always the ideal way to look at how to approach a problem.
Yeah, I've been in similar situations and may have even been some of the influence to move to new frameworks. And in retrospect, the value that you get out of migrating to an entirely new framework ended up not being there. And I regret some of those decisions now. And now whenever those topics come up, I'm heavily skeptical of the value out of that, because it's a substantial amount of effort that just kind of promises the world at the end. And oftentimes I've seen that the world hasn't been given.
For sure. For sure. I agree. And I think there's one aspect of the hiring that we didn't cover, or maybe we kind of covered it tangentially, is not just the ability to find new talent, but the ability to retain the talent you have. So I've worked with many people that when they were asked to work on a project that was using, say, Angular JS or something in the last couple of years, they say, you know, no, like I'm not going to do that, because if this job fails, like if I get fired or this company goes under or something, and I have to go out on the job market and say for the last 5 years I've been working on Angular JS instead of React or Vue, or, you know, they perceive that they're going to be far less marketable, or they're not going to get the salary they want. So there's a tangible fear in the developer community that if they're not on the newest or one of the newest tech stacks, that they're throwing their career away. So sometimes it can be that, you know, you have to consider, I'm not necessarily saying this is the reason to do it, but at least consider refreshing your tech stack periodically if you find that retention is a problem, or if you find that people are starting to complain that they're not using the newest stuff. You have to temper that so that you're not changing every year, as Tracy was saying, to the newest thing. People are a little bit more resilient than they let on, but it's definitely something to consider.
That's an interesting thing to it too, and I'm curious to your guys' thoughts. When being an Angular junkie, I'm a big fan of trying to stay as current as I possibly can to the major versions that they release, for the sole fact of trying to reduce maintenance costs. You know, as a product ages, JavaScript's moving so quickly now. If you fall too far behind, it becomes very difficult to, you know, find additional packages or do upgrades, those sorts of things. So I tried to push very hard. I'm curious, do you guys feel the same way, or is that sort of do you not feel migrating versions rapidly is in the best interest of your projects?
That's an interesting question. It's because, I mean, the answer is always right. The correct answer is it depends. But
right.
You know, I've found this to be an interesting challenge with Angular, though, because they have a very good strategy for communicating what their Semver policy is, right? So they do a really good job of telling you what are going to be breaking changes. But what I've observed is when you're looking for help or resources in areas that are changing or being refactored continuously, that is splintering the the amount of resources. Like you can find an answer to something that was true 2 versions ago but isn't true anymore. And that's making me start to think that I don't know what that means for the best strategy. That's something I'm thinking of. Whether it's better to just always stay current because the newest material is always going to be relevant to you, or whether it's good to find a good niche where you stay in a version for a while, like an LTS style version, a bit like Node does, right? We're supposed to sort of stay in those even numbered versions for a longer period of time while they develop the next stuff, and then you kind of move over. It gives you like 3 years to kind of do that. I tend not to want to be like always on the newest, but I don't think you want to get too far behind, like you said. Yeah,
I mean, sometimes I see teams, and especially when let's say Angular first start, Angular was in alpha beta, and I hear some teams saying, yeah, we've been on Angular since the beta, and I'm thinking, my God, why? Why would you torture yourself that way? I remember using Angular material in alpha when the team was saying, don't use it. Why are you using this in production? Granted, my production apps were pretty small, right? But yeah, I mean, I actually, if you think about Ember, Vue, React, and Angular, they all do a pretty good job at kind of, making it easy for you to stay up to date. But I know a lot of companies as well find it really difficult to do. Probably you guys have more experience on this, but of the reasoning. But a lot of companies actually can't stay up to date, right? Like they just, for some reason.
I mean, that's another migration topic. I mean, just moving from one version to another version. It's like you're going through all this effort for what? The reasoning is often not entirely clear. And if it is, there might be like some security vulnerability and you have to migrate in order to make sure that your app stays protected. But it's like if you move from React version X to React version Y and everything stays completely the same, why would you do it?
Because it's supposed to be really easy, right, Jarrod?
Supposed to be. If it was, then that's great.
I think Angular's done a really good job of that. Yeah, I think Angular's done a really good job of that. The first versions were a little sticky and it was a little more difficult. And they've really gotten to the point now they've put a lot of effort into telling you how to transition between things. And then the big powerful thing that they have is their CLI, which can help you auto-update everything properly, can even change your code to make sure the updates are applied properly so that everything continues to work. And between versions now, there's a pretty famous article that I don't remember exactly who it was, but it was a major company, and they talked about how they moved a website with millions and millions of visitors to the next version in a day, and with little risk. And so that's a really, I think they're doing a solid job of helping you bump those versions because they are moving it so quickly, and they also put a lot of effort into it internally, which then helps us in the end. So, they do an upgrade on all of Google's code base to the next version before we even do. So they know how the process looks, what the gotchas are, and they build the tools that help that process work so that then when the community makes that next bump, it's supposed to be as seamless as possible. And there are lots of benefits from the Angular CLI side because we start getting all kinds of advanced features like Ivy's coming, and that'll be a thing to bump to. So faster compiles, smaller builds, all that sort of stuff that as long as you're sort of staying current, you're getting. Having said that, that's kind of one example. There's lots of stuff out there that's not that smooth. I think that's something we should, if we build libraries, and I'm not a maintainer, so it's easy for me to say this, it would be great to have that sort of process to make it easier to migrate. I think the more we focus on that, the easier it is for the community, but that's also a lot of work. So it's kind of a balance.
Well, Ember also does a really good job at, letting upgrading to the latest version be really seamless. ArcGIS, I know, obviously does that too. Maybe not so obvious yet. I mean, we try. What about Vue and React?
I'm not an expert on particularly their strategies that they're using. I know when Vue made a pretty large transition to the major version upgrade that they had. And I mean, they're going to have another major version upgrade hopefully this year, if everything goes right, they'll have another major version. But they've had sort of like scripts or utilities that helped people move from one version to the next version. So I think from V1 to V2, I think Chris Fritz had something or worked on something that really helped a lot with doing that kind of migration. I think anything automated is great. But I think one of the things that we want to look at, and I think one of the things that you want to think about in this is that there's been multiple instances this year, or not just this calendar year, but in the last year, where we've uncovered that a lot of people's projects are not using, say, lock files to control their dependencies, but rather they're sort of just every time their app is installed, it might grab an entirely new set of dependencies. And there's been instances where people have put up broken versions of libraries that have instantly tanked builds and projects and products because people are just sort of sucking in these things right away. And I think when you're talking about whether to move from one version of a framework to another, I think it goes all the way down your dependency chain. I think it's best to just stay on what you're on, lock in exactly what you have so your builds are deterministic from one build to the next, and then consciously and continuously evaluate the updates that you have available. Because usually with these frameworks, if they're going from, say, 1.1 to 1.2, it's going to be very straightforward to do that, and you'll very low risk. But if you miss the 1.2 upgrade, and then you miss the 1.2 to 1.3 upgrade, and then you miss the 1.3 to 2.0 upgrade, now you're going from 1.2 to 2.0, your list is growing. And there's a really good site for Angular that does this, where you put the version of Angular that you're using in the version that you want to get to, and it lays out all the steps. And if you're doing those near ones, it's just like, oh, it's simple. Run this utility. Make sure you're not using this interface, and you're good. But if you start, the longer it gets, it starts being like, careful. This is a lot of work, and it's
Right.
these intense things. So I think you just lock what you have, stay where you are, but then constantly reevaluate whether it's time to move, and just don't let yourself get so far behind that it goes from being a refactoring to a migration, because that's the cost goes up exponentially. But when you wait that long.
I absolutely agree with the locked file statement. I think that's really important. Ben Lesh posted yesterday a good example of what happens if you don't. When RxJS did that April's Fool prank last year, and because of a mix-up in publishing, suddenly everyone's stuff broke, and he had to do all kinds of wonky things to get it running again. And a lot of people would have been spared if they had just locked down their versions instead of just immediately ingesting this sort of joke that, April Fool's joke that was funny to a lot of us, but probably pretty painful for some people.
Thankfully,
For sure.
people didn't have to suffer for that long.
Yes, yeah, he fixed it quickly.
Okay, so we talked a lot about reasons why you would do them and reasons why you wouldn't do migration. So I think one thing that we should talk about a bit is just the different ways that you can go about it, right? Because we've probably been a part of many different types of migrations, and the most common one that most people do is the Big Bang, right? They start the migration, and the development team goes dark, and they show up in a year with the same product, but migrated, hopefully. And one of the things that we always said in the company I worked for was that nobody ever got promoted off of a migration, but a lot of people have been fired off of them. And I think the way that you structure the migration is so important, because that Big Bang is probably, we would say, the most time efficient. It's the fastest way to do a migration, because that's all you're focused on is doing the migration. But it's also the riskiest. It's also the costliest, and your users are usually not happy. So what are your guys' thoughts, or do you have any funny stories about Big Bang integrations? And then, do you guys have other things that you've learned are sort of the better approach for any of these types of migrations, whether it's front-end migrations or provider migrations or any of that?
Yeah, that is a fantastic, fantastic question, and I love your statement that no one ever gets promoted over a migration, but you can easily get fired. And I think actually just framing it like that kind of puts the risk in perspective. Like, if you are the one pushing for a migration, you better be very, very certain that it is valuable enough to do that, because you can easily lose a lot if it doesn't go well. And I think that the important thing to do in any sort of a big project like this is to cut it up into milestones that can be produce something deliverable so that you can show iterative progress, and you can also stop work at some point in order to work on something that might be higher priority. If you wait for a year-long project and you don't deliver value to the very end, the value is going to be heavily criticized as to whether or not it was worthwhile. But if you can cut that up into 5 chunks and then deliver 1 or 2, and then maybe work on something higher priority, and then continue a migration down the line, it allows you to just to readjust as necessary.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, is that accountability in a big refactor like that is utterly important for business to be aware of where you stand, what's being accomplished, sort of what that process looks like. You know, working in a dark vacuum and then just coming out the other end with something, it's, you know, not agile. It's not how we want to approach those problems. So just having a good game plan for what are the pieces that we're breaking up, how are we targeting them, what can we expect to see, really putting that plan together before you sort of start the refactor goes a long way towards both it being more efficient and having better accountability to the people that are ultimately paying the bills on this. You know, I think that's a super important piece that often gets missed, because there's a lot of people that just get eager to, like, let's get into this new stuff, let's build this new thing, we can build it super quick, and a lot of times that can go south on you, especially when you have to consider stuff like regressions and bugs that you fixed previously in whatever the original iteration was, but did you account for them when you redid it? That sort of stuff can really bite you if you don't plan ahead accordingly for it.
For sure. Yeah, I like that. And I like this idea. So, you know, as developers, we're probably familiar with the concept of like the MVP, right? The minimum viable product. I think with migrations, one of the things that you always want to talk about is what would it look like to have like an MVM, a minimum viable migration. And I think one of the first milestones that you want to hit when you're talking about migrations is, what is the minimum amount of things that we need to do so that we can do all new development in the migrated platform in whatever capacity that means, and then slowly we'll backfill the rest. Right. And like, it kind of sucks for a while to have 2 systems running. But like, if you're moving from AWS to Azure or something like that, you know, what is the minimum amount of infrastructure we need to set up in Azure so that we can do new features in Azure and slowly port the AWS stuff over as we have time? Or we worked with a client that was taking a backend rendered, like a .NET solution, and they wanted to port over to using React. And so we decided, well, what is the minimum amount of stuff that we can do? You know, do we have to turn it all the way into a SPA? Do we have to rip it entirely out of the server? Or can we start building pieces of this application in React alongside your .NET? So it still comes from the server on each page load, but you're still rendering elements of the UI in React. And then later you can decide to convert it all into a SPA if you want to, and sort of like hydrate it on the server side, or excuse me, on the client side, and use it from there. So that conversation of like the MVM, I think is key to deciding. That's what you should make your plan on. That should be the first part of your plan.
And I think you also bring up a really exciting thing in our industry right now, which is, you know, stuff like Angular elements, you know, HTML components, these isolated functional pieces of code that can live in their own. So you don't have to build the full SPA with all of the routes. You can still have individualized pieces that are their own Angular, you know, applications or React applications that live within just a small piece of the page that allow you to do that, you know, dynamic rendering and things, but still keep it isolated to a piece so that you can slowly transition a page. You know, it's big. It's really common in AngularJS to sort of port AngularJS over to Angular and do it slowly by route and by component. That sort of stuff is really exciting. I think that's it takes a lot of the anxiety out of doing these MVMs, because it allows you to really target and isolate pieces. And it's something that, you know, if you're going from Adobe Flex or .NET, probably more Adobe Flex, but like, you can't do that in Adobe Flex. You have to go the whole kit and caboodle, because there is no cross-pollination. But I think that's just really exciting to me to see that sort of stuff coming about. I'm really excited about where those components are going to go in terms of pushing the web forward.
I've never been lucky enough to work at a company that had a big front-end presence, big enough that they needed to have like a new beta version coming out, and things like Twitter and I'm having a hard time thinking of other examples. Where you have like the new Twitter and the old Twitter. Like I love that that style of migration. It's like they're two totally different things, but you can progressively see and buy into yourself or opt into the new version as you find it fits your needs. Then you can always go back to the old one if necessary. And that's something that I would love to be able to work on, because it allows you to take bigger chances, because if it doesn't work, then users can always go back to what does work until it's the new perfect version.
It's super risky though, right? Like what was it, Snapchat, I believe, redid their app and widely panned as horrible, and how did you do this and why did you do this? And they spent a lot of time and effort in isolation doing this brand net new version, and just people hated it. People just like, don't do this to us. Take this away from us. Maybe it wasn't Snapchat, but it was one of the big players, and they did that. And it's like, that makes, I think, a lot of industry players really scared.
Yeah. Well, and there's Google with their inbox. Like it seemed like it was, in retrospect, like it was clearly an experiment that was probably not meant to live forever. But they were able to explore different patterns there, roll that back into Gmail, and then just kill off the new one. And that way all the people who are using Gmail just feel like they just got a new product, or just new additions over time, instead of really having the risk of completely revamping Gmail into something else.
100%. I think one other part of these migration plans that we need to talk about, because I think it would be foolishness if we don't talk about this, is whenever you're migrating, as we mentioned, right? Migrations are no new behavior, and really no new cleanliness inside, right? You just change some components, but it should be the same system. So that we keep saying the phrase same system, but you need to be able to know what you have. And for a lot of teams, they don't. For a lot of teams, they either don't have requirements, or this application was built piecemeal, bug by bug, or bug fix by bug fix over 10, 15 years. And they don't actually know where they are relative to where they started. And so testing is such a big part of all migrations. You need to know what it is you think you have, so that you know when you've finished at the end. And in this case, if you're changing from React to Vue or what have you, like something, or I don't know that you would, I'm not recommending anybody migrate from the 3 major key frameworks right now, but if you're moving UI frameworks, unit testing might be much more difficult in that circumstance, because perhaps the way that you test is so different. So in this case, you might have to rely on manual testing, end-to-end testing, integration testing, things like that, things that may be a little bit non-traditional, but you want to make sure you have the full suite of tests when you're doing stuff like this, because that's about one of the only ways you're going to know whether you got back to where you started. And that's where most migrations that I know of went bad, is that somewhere along the way, people rediscovered very important business rules that they didn't realize existed, but the system was just protecting.
Yeah, absolutely. I did a testing podcast with Applitools a little while ago, and I think that the migration of front-end frameworks is actually a really, really sensitive one, especially when you think about the future, where you might want to just completely rip one out and put another one in. If you tie your tests too much around a framework, then you are ripping out your safety net when you do a migration, and that is very, very scary. And it's important to make sure that unit tests are down to the vanilla JavaScript level, where you're just testing function input and output. And then you have a large suite of integration tests and end-to-end tests that test just browser APIs and the standard DOM APIs that you get everywhere. So that between that, you can do what you have to do with whatever framework you have, but you're not overly investing in that framework's testing suite, because it's just that'll lock you in forever, and migrations will be so much more dangerous if you have to migrate all of your tests at the exact same time.
Well, and Applitools is a really interesting one too, because the visual testing that they provide is really handy. We did, long before I knew what Applitools was, I did a migration on a previous client that had Angular material, and we bumped the version up And since we had layered a bunch of stuff on top of it, some things had changed and it had broken some of our UI. And we weren't aware of it until some manual testing occurred. And we could have caught that a lot faster if we had had Apple Tools visual testing, available to us at the time. We would have then known right away. And that kind of migration safety, tools like that are really great for protecting you from those situations. And Apple Tools, thankfully, is like you said, agnostic from one particular framework. They do pretty much everything.
Well, awesome. Great. Well, this was a great conversation about migrations. As with all the conversations, performance architecture, right? The conversation will not stop here. There's a lot more that we can cover. So, certainly we'll come back and we'll have a chance to sort of explore some of those. But one of the things that we like to do as we close out the podcast is sort of celebrate some of the things that we love at this.labs. And if there's anything we love, if there's something we love the most at this.labs, it's puns and it's bad jokes. So to sort of pair with the April Fool's conversation that we had earlier, I thought we would maybe do our best developer dad jokes or bad puns that you have. And I'll start us out with one, and I might have one at the end. But so here you go, guys. What kind of computer sings the best? Adele.
That was good.
That was all right.
Well played.
You get that.
All right, Tracy, do you have one?
Oh, you're gonna have to give me a second.
Okay, we'll come back to you. How about you, Jarrod? Do you got one?
Unfortunately, I don't have a developer one, but I go back and forth with my son frequently, and he got me with a new joke. Why does shark swim in salt water? And I don't know. It's because pepper would make him sneeze. And that's I hadn't heard that before, and normally I've heard them a million times, so that got me, and that was good.
Nice.
I have one now. Unless James wants to go first.
Sure.
Go ahead.
What's the second movie about a database engineer called? The Sequel. But
Let's go. Hey.
All right, Tracy.
Okay. What do you call a programmer student's spring vacation? String break.
Oh.
It was pretty bad.
That's the best ones, though. The best ones. So we do these at our meetups, these puns and these developer jokes. And I think the best ones are the ones where people groan. I mean, that is the definition of a dad joke. You're not supposed to laugh at a dad joke. You're supposed to groan. Only the dad's supposed to laugh. That's what makes a dad joke great.
And you can never make a meetup laugh completely, but you can make an entire meetup groan at once.
Yeah. That is very true. I have another one. How do you make your code seem better than it actually is? You can sugarcoat it.
Oh,
that was good.
why did the parents forbid their children from learning about regular expression or regular expressions? Because they didn't want them playing with matches.
Oh, that was actually pretty good. I like that.
Okay. And on that note, we will wrap up. So thank you, everybody, for joining us on the This.Labs podcast. As I mentioned, my name is Rob Ocel. You can find me on Twitter at Rob Ocel. That's ROBOCELL. Also, thank Tracy for being here. You can find her on Twitter at Lady Leet. Thank James for being here as well. You can find him on Twitter at MySpivey, MySpivey. And Jarrod, thank you for being here. And you can find him on Twitter at JS Overson. So JSOVERSON. And, as we say, the conversation doesn't stop here. So feel free to reach out to us. Let us know what you wanted us to talk about with migrations or what you want us to talk about in the future. And, we'd be happy to, bring that up. So thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.